President-elect Donald Trump is at odds with mayors of so-called sanctuary cities across the United States over whether local officials will aid federal agents in deporting immigrants. City officials in Denver and Aurora have issued statements clarifying that they will continue to not enforce federal immigration policy. Ed, as you look at this, do you think it was wise for city officials in Denver and Aurora to reaffirm their stances this week?
Let me start by giving a big shout out to the Denver Post, because as I was thinking about this last night, I actually asked the question, I wonder how much this would really cost Denver. And then I woke up this morning to find out $175 million is the number it would cost Denver. And I think that should put a whole different spin on this argument. I mean, let's be clear. Trump has made a ton of promises in a ton of areas that he's not going to be able to fulfill. And that's not just Trump, that's a typical candidate shooting for the White House. This is one he probably could. This is less a maneuver that requires you to get past the Senate's hurdle on stopping filibusters, and more one you could really do with a budget schematic. So this is more than bluster in this point. This is something that could really happen. Denver's got to think hard and fast about whether or not they want to lose almost 10% of their budget standing up to the president on this. But the other thing I think we really need to consider is that Barack Obama, who was opposed to this idea, had 8 years to go about trying to change federal law in terms of requiring this immigration rule to be followed by cities and states. In fact, he had 2 years when he had a Senate and a House that were both democratically controlled. And it speaks to how he just allowed people to go ahead and not follow the federal law with no consequences, which may have seemed fine at the time, but seemed to not envision there could actually be a successor president who may disagree with his interpretation of this. It's not the only issue this is going to be coming up on. This is the same way that we're going to have to deal with state marijuana laws in places like Colorado now, since rather than try to change federal law, Obama said, we'll just go ahead and turn a slight blind eye to the states doing this. That's a lot to kick around there. All in all, though, I think it's got to be debated a lot more vigorously than kind of the stance that has been taken, which is, I don't like this law, I don't want to follow it.
David, Representative Mike Coffman reaffirmed his stance that he supports the president's idea that the federal government should be able to pull funding from cities that are, again, so-called sanctuary cities. We talked about this before the show. It's a consistent mark from Mike Coffman, but were you surprised to hear that reaffirmation so soon after a re-election bid where it was clearly a major issue in his district?
He's been consistent on this the whole time, so he's continuing to be, and it's a topic in the news, so that's to be expected. Whatever powers Congress has to cut off federal funding to cities, which shouldn't exist in the first place, cities should fund themselves, and Congress should fund the federal government and not borrow money from China and other despotic entities in order to spend money it doesn't have and pass it out to local governments. It's clear that state and local governments cannot be forced to themselves enforce federal laws. That's a key part of our system of federalism. If Congress wants to enforce something, go hire federal employees and go do it, but you can't conscript the Denver Police Department or the Aurora Police Department or the University of Colorado into doing that enforcement for you. That is a principle that was reaffirmed in 1996 in the case of Prince versus United States, where Congress, to enforce a gun control law, had said local sheriffs and police departments have to carry out background checks on gun buyers. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision by Justice Alito, said no. Congress, you want background checks? Go hire people to do background checks for you. You can't order Sheriff Jay Prince of Ravalli County, Montana, who's busy enough with other things to do, to go snooping around on handgun buyers in his county. And Gail Norton wrote the amicus brief in that case, our Attorney General. I assisted in that on behalf of the state governments. And this is an example of how our constitutional system is so great and ought to be enforced, because when the Prince case was going on, it was like, oh, if you're right wing, you're on Sheriff Prince's side, and if you're left wing, you want unlimited federal coercion over the states and local governments. Well, now the shoe's on the other foot, and that's the genius of federalism: is issues come and go, but our structure of the separate sovereignty of state and local governments versus the federal government is a key protection of civil liberties.
Natasha, 10% is a big blow. If it came down to it and Denver lost that federal funding to a variety of grants, like Ed said, and so eloquently quoting the Denver Post, $175 million. Should the Denver City Council prepare more for possibly complying or possibly dealing with a 10% loss in their budget?
Well, I think after anything that we've learned about polling our predictions in the last week, they should prepare for both. They should investigate both options. I think what's interesting, and I always love the history lessons, but in more recent history, I remember when Denver made the decision to do this and pursue this, and at the time it made big news. It kind of felt like it was this moment. Denver was really stepping out on their own. It felt like something different. And then today, as I'm preparing for the show and looking back at the list of cities that have also done that, it's extensive. We're not alone. Chicago, New York, Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Providence, Santa Fe, Washington, D.C. So if we're looking at the federal government pulling funds from us, they'd also have to look at potentially pulling funds from all of those cities. So this isn't a bully on the playground situation, or if it is, there's at least a lot of other kids in the corner with us.
Some pretty big kids, too. This is all the federal funding pulling from New York City. I have no idea what their budget is. I'm pretty sure it's a little bit bigger than Denver's. Noel, what's been the local response to the affirmation from both Mayor Hancock and officials in Aurora on this stance that, hey, no, we're going to continue what we've done so far, which is not comply to this idea?
My inbox has been burning up from the people who are like really angry over this and like we've got to get criminals out of the country. But we need to stop and look at it from a local law enforcement perspective. Okay, so Denver's downtown detention center is already operating at maximum capacity, and it has for several years now. So if Denver police start stopping people, checking their immigration status, taking them to the Denver jail, and then we have to hold them on ICE detainers until someone from immigration can come pick them up, which I think is 6 days after what their normal release date would have been, whether it was on bond or they've served their time, that would add hundreds of people potentially a day to an already overcrowded jail. And also I've covered police and sheriff's departments in South Carolina and here consistently since 2009, and they've repeatedly said these are vulnerable populations. They're already scared and confused. Criminals know it. They are targets. We want them to feel comfortable calling 911 and knowing that we will respond, we will serve them because they're part of our community, and that would therefore get the real criminals off the street. We're not interested in deporting. We want to go after the bad guys.